from the Missouri School of Journalism. Welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. The nation of Papua New Guinea is an unusual place for a number of reasons. Located about 100 miles off the north coast of Australia, the country of 7.5 million people is home to more than 850 different languages, some of which have no known linguistic relative. Many people in Papua New Guinea live quite traditionally as subsistence farmers or hunters. Only about 15% of the country's population lives in towns or cities, and at least a couple dozen groups are considered uncontacted tribes with no significant communication with the outside world. These factors have also made it difficult for the government and aid agencies to respond to a magnitude 7.5 earthquake that hit the country in late February. The quake has been followed by about 200 aftershocks that have triggered mudslides and even a tsunami warning. More than 500,000 people are estimated to be in need of humanitarian assistance. And complicating matters further is Papua New Guinea's long history of tribal warfare, one exacerbated in recent years as young men have traded their spears and arrows for semi-automatic rifles. According to Amnesty International, the communal violence has helped make Papua New Guinea one of the most dangerous places in the world for women. The human rights group cites estimates that as many as half the country's women and girls are victims of sexual violence. On this edition of Global Journalist, a look at the aftermath of a large earthquake in one of the most remote countries on Earth, and how the response has been threatened by fighting between tribal groups. We're going to bring in three people who have been tracking this issue closely. Joining us from the Papua New Guinean capital is Sonia Yeung. She's an aid worker for the group World Vision International. We're also joined by Tom Westbrook. He's a correspondent for Reuters in Sydney, Australia, who's been reporting on Papua New Guinea. And also in Sydney is Connell. He's a human geographer and professor at the University of Sydney who previously worked as a consultant for the government of Papua New Guinea. Let me start with you, Tom Westbrook. Give us just an overview of the impact of this earthquake.
Well, this was a big one, 7.5, as you said, hit early in the morning, a little more than 2 months ago, before dawn, and the original shock killed somewhere in the vicinity of 100 people, triggering, as it triggered landslides, it covered whole villages, it severely damaged a couple of major towns that are in this part of the world, which is very remote. It hit in the southern highlands of Papua New Guinea, which is a remote, sort of rugged area that isn't terribly populated in terms of cities and towns, but has villages scattered throughout, and it's those places that sort of bore the brunt of the quake, which, as you said, has been followed by 200 or so aftershocks. Some of those were deadly as well. And the scale of the damage has also, sorely tested the capacity, the finances, and the ability of Papua New Guinea's government to respond.
And give us just a sense, Tom, if you would, about the challenges of getting aid to some of these areas that were affected by this earthquake. It sounds like just a small fraction of the roads in Papua New Guinea are paved, and in many places, villages aren't linked by roads.
Logistics has been a huge issue. Even communication has been a tough one. The quake knocked out a lot of mobile communications, so that left shortwave radio as one of the main ways to contact these remote villages that are closest to where it hit. And there are air access only places at the best of times, with landslides covering some of the few roads that do run out there. Helicopters have been the main means of recovery, and there's a limited amount of helicopters, and they can only carry a small amount of supplies. So what people need has been food, especially water, because the quake knocked over water storage tanks and also filled rivers that had been drinking water sources with mud and dirt. And so it's been an enormous challenge for aid workers and for the government to reach these places with the help that's needed. Some 60,000 people roughly without the shelter that they need, and as the aftershocks have continued to rumble, it's really rattled the nerves of people who have not, even though Papua New Guinea is on the ring of fire and earthquakes are relatively common, one of this size in the highlands region hasn't struck in something like 100 years, and the people there have not been familiar with this sort of disaster.
Well, Sonia Yeung of World Vision, you're in Papua New Guinea now. You've been responding to this natural disaster. Talk to us about some of the damage that you've seen. I understand you just traveled to the earthquake-affected region recently.
That's right. From what I can see so far, the landslides that's been caused by the earthquake has damaged or buried essentially communities and have forced people to have relocate permanently in some cases. Other communities that have been damaged have now been forced to temporarily relocate, and they are currently gathering in temporary displacement centres where there are no services available. So there's now a great risk of communicable diseases in these places, and yet people are quite fearful to go back because of the aftershocks. As Tom has mentioned, we have yet to be able to reach all the communities for all of us, and so we're still working on trying to get out to really understand and assess the situation out there.
And John Connell, I understand that you traveled at one time to this Hila province in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. Talk to us about what's different or unique about this. This is where the sort of epicenter of the earthquake was.
I think it's the worst possible place for an earthquake to have occurred of that magnitude. It's, by any standards, one of the remotest parts of Papua New Guinea. Many of the people live off highways. They must walk to wherever they want to go, to schools, to churches, to stores. They're unfamiliar with earthquakes, as Tom said. Earthquakes are much more common on the northern side of New Guinea rather than that particular area. But also, this is an upland area. It's 2,000 meters, 6,000 feet above sea level. It's fairly impoverished. People live by subsistence, and they do it hard. So it's a very, very poor area, and the communications are poor as well. It's not just physical communications of roads. It's also the fact that radio reception is non-existent. If people have radios, telephone reception is the same thing. So people are out of touch. They don't really know what's going on. They don't know when relief might come. They don't know what is going on in the next valley. So this was one of the worst places for an earthquake of that size.
And Tom Westbrook, describe for us, if you could, sort of the scale or scope of the relief effort. I understand the Papua New Guinean government has been trying to send emergency aid to the worst affected areas, as have some neighboring countries.
Yeah, that's right. The Papua New Guinea government has set aside a sum of money, a sizable sum of money, and they've also received something in the vicinity of $60 million US dollars in donations from neighbouring countries, but also places around the world. So China, the EU, Japan, New Zealand, the US. But according to the UN, the bulk of the money has come from private corporations, including ExxonMobil, which has a very big gas project in the highlands. A couple of other oil companies and some banks in PNG have donated, which is great. But one of the I guess things that the money hasn't been able to do is actually move the aid to the places where it's needed. So Port Moresby, the capital, is not really, which is where a lot of this aid is sort of beginning to build up. It's not really the place where it needs to be if it's to get to the highlands. They're accessible by air and by road more easily from Lae, which is on the north coast of PNG. So some aid is beginning to trickle through from there, but as Sonia and John have pointed out, like these are really remote places, and they don't know what's going on in the next valley, as John said. So the central government has got a huge task to try and piece together who needs what and where and how to get it to them.
This is Global Journalist. On today's program, we're talking about the aftermath of a huge earthquake in Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea is a remote Pacific nation that includes the eastern half of the island of New Guinea, as well as a series of other islands. With us from the Papua New Guinean capital is Sonia Yeung. She's an aid worker with the Christian aid group World Vision International. Also on the line is Tom Westbrook, a correspondent for Reuters in Sydney, Australia, who's been reporting on Papua New Guinea. And also joining us from Sydney is John Connell, a human geographer and professor at the University of Sydney, who previously worked as a consultant for the Papua New Guinean government. Sonia Yeung, if I could turn this to you now as well, could you just give us a description of how the quake has affected food and water supplies in the area as well? As you mentioned, many of the people in this area are subsistence farmers.
That's right. After the earthquake that has caused landslides, it has severely affected both the food gardens, essentially washing them out, but also affected the rivers and creeks as well. Now the water sources have turned muddy, which means that any kind of fish that were available to the communities in the past are also no longer available. They have been wiped out.
And this is because the rivers, the streams are literally just silted up with mud, and that effectively killed the fish.
That's right. In terms of the oxygen levels in the river and the creeks, it's no longer enough to keep these fish alive, essentially. But also it's severely affected the main water source for these communities as well. In addition to that, not only is the water contaminated, but when people are using it to wash themselves, is actually giving people skin rashes. So not only are they not able to drink it, but it's also causing diseases as well, or it's opening up the risk for people to actually get communicable and waterborne diseases.
Well, John Connell, if I could turn this to you, one of the unusual features of this natural disaster is that it seems to have also fostered an outbreak of intertribal violence, and Papua New Guinea has a long history of that. Tell us just a bit about that.
Violence has been a recurrent feature of the highlands of New Guinea and in some other parts of Papua New Guinea as well. There are a number of reasons. Probably the greatest reason is that people are short of resources, population pressure is very great, there's competition for land, and that competition sometimes spills over into violence. It's really important to remember, I think, that this part of the world was only contacted from the outside in the late 1930s and came under more or less, if you like, administrative control after the Second World War. So people are still in circumstances where they're not really used to dealing with different neighbors who speak different languages and so on. So all these things are now coming to the fore as there is competition for aid and the necessary resources to get back on their feet again after this earthquake.
And Tom Westbrook, you had reported on an incident that occurred a few weeks ago where actually a UN convoy came under attack in the southern highlands trying to bring aid to the affected areas. Tell us what happened.
The local authorities had become very worried in Hela province in Tari about violence escalating and have in fact paused the distribution of aid. The United Nations said they withdrew temporarily from the township. It's probably the largest town nearest to the epicenter. It was severely damaged in the quake. It's also a place where people from villages in the surrounding hinterland that have been destroyed have come seeking help. And the situation there is such that the Defence Force has been deployed to try and bring some calm and restore order so that aid can start to flow again. And just speaking to the local authorities there, you really get the sense, we've been speaking to them by telephone, and you can hear in their voices the amount of stress and strain that the quake and the aftershocks have caused. You speak to, you phone the police station, you speak to the policemen, and they're without the wherewithal they need to do their job, and without funds or equipment to get to where they need to be. And the police, the police officers themselves are sleeping outside their own homes, afraid to go inside because it might be knocked down in an aftershock. Their families are worried. Everyone is doing it quite tough.
And Sonia, Yeung, one of the features of some of this fighting there have been reports of widespread sexual violence and rape as one group attacks another. Can you tell us a little bit what you've seen and heard about that?
I think a lot of this is tied in with the lack of protection because of all these kind of services and institutions that have or are no longer accessible by the communities. Given that they can't access water nearby, a lot of people, and this role is traditionally done by women as well as children, will now have to walk much further just to get clean drinking water. There's no more toilets as well, so often these communities would have to actually openly defecate, which means that they are just open to harassment by others, and they're also in unfamiliar environment as well, given that a lot of them have to be temporarily relocated, which means that once again they're not in a familiar environment, they're susceptible to other communities and members that they're not familiar with without their normal traditional shelter and protection available to them.
And John Connell, you had mentioned that this was one of the where this earthquake occurred was actually maybe the worst possible place in Papua New Guinea where it could have happened. Papua New Guinea is on this sort of Pacific rim of fire, which is sort of a seismically active area. So talk to us just a little bit about how the country has responded to some natural disasters in the past.
Well, Papua New Guinea has had a range of natural disasters. Earthquakes are fairly common. Earthquakes are common on the northern coast of New Guinea, across through the islands of New Britain and Bougainville, but they're often smaller earthquakes and rarely of this size. So most people have been able to cope with that. Volcanic eruption has been a significant problem. For example, the island of Manam, just off the north coast, pretty well exploded 14 years ago. 10,000 people had to leave the island, had to be resettled on the mainland. That happened in one of the large cities of Rabaul 20 years ago. So there's a constant fear of volcanic activity. There's a constant movement of people in response to that. There have also been tsunamis. A tidal wave wiped out 2,500 people almost exactly 20 years ago on the north coast of New Guinea. And now, of course, the country is facing climate change, which may well significantly worsen the livelihoods of people who live on small offshore islands, particularly on coral atolls. So there are a number of natural hazards, a number of different natural disasters that Papua New Guinea faces. It has a national disaster service, but it's not particularly well funded, it's not particularly well organized, and it's found some difficulty coping with the scale of disasters and their frequency over the past couple of decades.
A reminder that you're tuned into Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. On today's program, we're talking about the aftermath of a big earthquake in the remote Pacific nation of Papua New Guinea and ensuing communal violence there. We're joined by Sonia Yeung of World Vision International, Tom Westbrook from Reuters, and John Connell from the University of Sydney. If you're interested in more Global Journalists, check us out online at globaljournalist.org. There you can find our archives and additional coverage of underreported international news and human rights issues. You can also like us on Facebook, where we live stream, follow us on Twitter, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, or see our video cast on YouTube. And Tom Westbrook, if I could turn this back to you, Papua New Guinea is mainly a nation of subsistence farmers, agriculturalists, hunters, but there is also, as you mentioned, this very large liquefied natural gas facility there run by a consortium of companies, including Exxon Mobil. How did the quake affect this gas plant, which is so important to Papua New Guinea's economy?
The quake's epicenter almost hit like a bullseye the main processing facility for this liquefied natural gas project, which is the single biggest revenue earner for the government. It's basically the most important source of income, and it stopped for about a month and a half. It has just begun to produce gas again and is expected to reach its full productive capacity imminently, which is a good thing for revenue flowing to the government, because it will need that money to spend on distributing aid and providing services which it is supposed to provide. But it's also been the source of real controversy because a lot of the people in the affected areas believe that the oil and gas industry is in some way responsible for the quake or responsible for exacerbating its effects. And this has become, it's caused a real backlash among locals who believe Exxon and its partners may in some way have caused this disaster. And it's something the government has had to respond to. I mean, the Geohazards Department has said that there's no link between the gas industry and the quake, that earthquake activity has been happening for eons in this part of the world, at least much, much longer than the oil and gas industry has been there. But they have begun to call for local politicians want to see a full inquiry into whether or not it's been made worse by the fact that the oil and gas industry is there. It's not unheard of that such activity can cause seismic activity. The Australian government has been commissioned to do a report into it, Australia's geoscience body, which they've done, which concluded that there was no evidence that the quake was caused by the oil and gas industry, but it's definitely something that's going to be a problem, going forward.
Well, Sonia Yeung, you are in Papua New Guinea. Are these rumors that you've heard as well?
Absolutely. A lot of communities are fearful of what the earthquake has done or what mining has done to cause this earthquake, but also they're fearful that the mining activities have now caused the earthquake, which has in turn affected the water quality as well. So I think the idea for a lot of the NGOs who are now responding to the earthquake is really seeing how we can actually help the communities or equip them with knowledge on what causes earthquakes, how they can actually be more aware of what these activities and how they can actually react to them. As I've said before, whilst the PNG is used to earthquakes, the highlands area is not. And this is often for a lot of people the first major earthquake that they've experienced. And so a lot of work must go into equipping these communities with knowledge on the earthquake. And also we can see this as a good opportunity to help communities build back better, to actually equip them with perhaps good hygiene behavior messaging, and also help them in terms of constructing better quality buildings that are able to withstand aftershocks, as well as future earthquakes as well.
And John Connell, if I could just pick up on this point about the oil and gas industry in Papua New Guinea, which I understand is quite new. It is a relatively poor country. As we mentioned, most of the people who live there live off the land, live very traditional lives, and yet Papua New Guinea also is rich in a number of minerals, as well as having quite promising oil and gas reserves. So it seems sort of tricky looking forward. How does the government balance the revenue that may be coming in from these natural resources with the needs of its people to ensure that this wealth is distributed equitably?
I should say, first of all, that it's worth remembering that in 2012, in this same area, there were some significant landslides that killed 40 people. And that at that time, too, people feared that it was the activities of mining companies underground that were causing the problem. So it's not so surprising that this has recurred again. Now, the Papua New Guinea economy is, of course, heavily dependent on oil and natural gas and more familiar mines for copper and gold. And there have been tensions at some of those mines in the past. The Bougainville copper mine has been closed for 25 years now because of conflicts between landowners at the mine site who have believed that they were getting a very poor deal from the mine and their environment is being damaged, and seeing profits in their eyes disappearing to the government and overseas. So to actually balance the benefits, the financial benefits from oil, gas, copper and gold against the necessity to distribute these resources more equitably, to get to people in places like this that are remote and have otherwise limited sources of income, has been one of the most difficult tasks for the government, and in general it's not been terribly successful at doing that.
And Tom Westbrook, when you look at sort of the scale of the damage done and the remoteness of the area that's affected, what's the timeline for rebuilding, for reconstructing? How long do you think it will take the country to recover from this quake?
Well, I asked the same question to a helicopter pilot who's been ferrying aid out to the hardest hit places, and his response was 10 to 15 years. And I had to double check that I'd heard that right. But the scale of this disaster is enormous. It's affected a wide swathe of land, and people have just walked away from the villages that they once lived in that have been buried or rendered uninhabitable. Schools, places, medical sort of centres, all these kind of places that community services have been damaged and destroyed, and simply bringing the wherewithal needed to repair them out to the highlands is a massive task, and one that is so far being beyond the local authorities on the ground. They just do not have what they need to get the job done.
And Sonia, Yeung, our time grows short with just about 20 seconds left. Tom paints a rather sort of pessimistic portrait of the near-term future for Papua New Guinea. Do you see things the same way?
I actually do see this more as an opportunity for us to actually help these communities who, even before the earthquake, already do not have any access to some of these services. They, I guess, do not have really a good access to clean drinking water or improved toilets. So we see that this perhaps as an opportunity for communities, as I said, to build back better, to actually look at what services infrastructure is needed that can withstand or weather through disasters like this one, and maybe future landslides as well.
We're out of time for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute at the Missouri School of Journalism and KBIA Mid-Missouri Public Radio. Many thanks to Tom Westbrook, Sonia Yeung, and John Connell for joining us. Our producer this week is Lily Cusack, who alas is leaving us to go to law school. Our supervising producer is Lauren Wortman. Jiwon Choi is visual editor. Aaron Hay is audio engineer, and Travis McMillan is director. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for tuning in.